I think everybody knows David already. So what is there to say? Except that my name is Joshua Roth, and since last year, David has made me think I should probably change my name.
Not intentionally.
And my brother, I forwarded the description of today's talk to my brother, whose name is Abraham. And I thought I got the short end of that naming economy in my family. Obviously, the firstborn got Abraham, and he's a year older than me. But it was last year. We've known each other for about 10 years or more. But it was last year when you were talking about the indigeneity in Judaism that I asked a question. And during that back and forth, you called on me, and you called me Jonathan. And I thought, oh, yes. There is a definite aversion to Joshua, which it coincided with me taking a sabbatical in Japan, and I started using my Japanese middle name last year, and so I've kind of embraced Hotaka. So you could call me Hotaka. I've kept my Jewish last name, Roth, but I have been kind of thinking about what you said in that other talk, and today probably about Joshua. And anyway, David is well. Let's just see. I think Mara Benjamin, when she gave her talk some months ago, mentioned David's book, Kabbalah and Ecology, God's Image in the More Than Human World, as kind of a pioneering work of ecological understandings in Jewish tradition. And he's also the organizer and facilitator of Torah Foragers, the weekly study Torah group, and Playground Minyan. So with that, I'll just turn it over to David. Thank you.
Thank you. So this grows out of the work I've done on Jews and indigenousness. And the root of that work is just a simple question. If everyone likes to say we're indigenous to Palestine, Israel, Canaan, whatever you want to call that place. And there's a lot of good reasons why that makes sense. Certainly, in terms of people with intact identities, we're the oldest people with an intact identity that is connected to that place. But for some reason, all of our stories talk about coming from a different place. Abraham comes from Mesopotamia. All of Jacob's family, except Benjamin, is born in Padan Aram. The nation forms as a nation in Egypt and then in the desert. So in fact, there's very little that happens in the land. The one person who stays in the land from the beginning to the end of his life is Isaac. Yeah. So why do we tell so many stories about not being from this land when, from most perspectives, aside from what the Torah says, it would appear that it's perfectly reasonable to say that the Israelites are indigenous? In fact, there is no evidence of a conquest by the Israelites of the Canaanites. And this is a rather important fact. I don't usually start with this fact, but I think it's not a bad one to start with today. I'm trying it out, okay? So if you have a conquest, then you have a burn layer, you have a layer where there's one kind of pottery, and then all of a sudden there's a different kind of pottery because there's a cultural change. These are the kinds of things that you do not find in Canaan. I don't know, what name should we call the place? It's such a silly thing to fight over names. As we know, people can have multiple names, and so can lands. So this place, whatever we want to call it, doesn't appear to have had a conquest, which means the Joshua story is a fantasy. Maybe that's some relief. But the Joshua story tells of repeated genocides, where the Israelites go conquer a city and kill every man, woman, and child, and every cow and goat too, just to make it thorough, more thorough. And it's a nasty motif. And it's not just in Joshua, it's in other places in the Torah, but much fewer than you might think, which is what we're going to get to in a moment. So the first question is, what do we do ethically with these texts? And the second question is, what do we do about the people who do the wrong thing ethically with these texts? And the third question is not really a question, how do we get rid of them? Well, we can't. We can't actually get rid of them. So what do we want to do with them? What can we learn from these texts? I don't have an answer to this question, by the way. What can we learn from these texts that is useful and meaningful? I'm not sure. Even Jericho, with the walls falling down, okay, there are fallen, tumbled down walls around Jericho, actually. However, they date to a period several hundred years before when Joshua could have lived. So when you look at Jericho, it looks like they saw a bunch of tumbled down walls, and like many cultures, came up with a story to explain this thing that they were encountering in the world. And this is common for all cultures. So it doesn't mean that it was fake. The question is, why is that the story they came up with? Why is that the myth that they came up with? The other thing is that Joshua and the other place in the Torah where this motif appears of genocide is Deuteronomy, are much later than the other books of the Torah. So what happened? We have one set of books that gives one vision, what I call the Torah of the stranger. And then in Deuteronomy and Joshua, we do have discussion of the stranger in a positive light also, even in Deuteronomy and a little bit in Joshua. But all of a sudden we have this motif of genocide, which isn't part of the rest of the Torah, with one caveat. There are two genocides mentioned in the rest of the Torah, which are not chosen wars, commanded wars, but rather wars of self-defense. One is the commanded genocide of the Amalekites, which never gets completed, which is why we have Purim coming up, because Haman was a descendant of Agag, who was the king of the Amalekites. So that's one thing. Second thing is the genocide of the Midianites, which happens in Numbers. And that's specifically because they devise a way to destroy the nation through getting the men to sleep with the women so that they will then worship the gods. And it's complicated, but it's seen as a direct attack. And so even though one is not military, but spiritual attack, the military attack back is considered self-defense. So within that framework, we can say, well, this is very migudar, this is very limited. It only applies to these two people for these specific reasons. But it doesn't say why we're supposed to wipe out the Canaanites exactly. It gives us a lot of generalities. Oh, their culture is an abomination. Well, what does that mean? All the cultures? It's not just one culture. There's the Canaanite, Girgashi, Hivi, Hitti, Yevusi. I'm not even naming them all. They each had a culture. So what I want to show you is that there is a different Torah that's the more primary Torah, the Torah of the stranger. That's the Torah of Abraham. And then I also want to show you how Joshua is attempting to resist that Torah and to raise the question, what politically was going on that made that a new story that all of a sudden needed to be told by somebody? And what was the faction? I don't have the answer to this, by the way. What was the faction that wanted that to shift the story from stranger to genocide? Somebody chose that as a new path to take Jewish or Israelite culture. Someone chose that as a way to undo the culture that was already there. And what was their political motivation? What happened? Why did it happen? That's a complicated question that I personally do not have the answer to, but I'm in the middle of still exploring. So that's the big framework. Now, what do we know about the Torah of the stranger? What do you know about the Torah of the stranger? We read some things about it in this week's Parsha. Don't oppress the stranger, remember that you were strangers in Egypt. And then there's the laws of the Shemitah year that appear for the first time in the Parsha that we just read, which says that everything that grows from the land is for you, can be for you. In other words, you can't plant it, but if it grows by itself, it should be for everyone, for you, for your children, for your servants, for your animals, for the wild animals, and for the stranger, meaning the person who is not an Israelite. That all this belongs to everyone. So we have two points in this previous parsha, and many, many more throughout the Torah, which say that the foundation of Jewish, or we should say Torah ethics, is treating the stranger equally to the neighbor and friend. And that's crystal clear, actually. I have a document on my website, Neighbor and Stranger. You can look at it if you go to neochassid.org. There's a link on the homepage, which lists every place the stranger is mentioned in the whole Tanakh. It's quite extensive, and it's quite overwhelming what the message is. There's not a lot of question about it. Yeah. So first we're going to explore that. What is that Torah of the stranger? Then we'll go back into this Torah of genocide question. And one thing I put in the class description is that we are living in a time in Jewish history where those two Torahs are directly in battle, and they directly represent two different parts of the Jewish world. And the truth is, right now, the Torah of genocide is winning that battle. I know that we're on the other side of that battle. And there are a lot of people on the other side of that battle, but we're not winning the political power right now, just as we're not in this country right now. It's a hard time. It's also a hard time because the shock of finding out about the Beavis children's deaths has just overwhelmed people emotionally, so that the filters that we might have towards saying things that, I'm not saying people are all of a sudden embracing genocide, God forbid, but the filters that keep us from saying some things that we might feel and think, but know, oh, that's not the right thing to say. For this moment, I hope this is just a moment, but for this moment, those filters are gone because people are so deeply angry and in ways that make perfect sense. There's no reason to deny people the right to anger and even hatred. But we're commanded to love the stranger and to love the neighbor and to love yourself. And that's despite whatever other feelings you have going on. Right? So the question is, how do we get to there? What do we do? That's not the purpose of this class, how do we get to there? But it's a question that's underlying everything that I'm thinking about and sharing with you. Any questions so far? Or interjections? Or objections? Okay. So let's go to the first clear discussion of what it means to be a stranger in Parshat Chaye Sarah. It comes up before that already. But this is just a beautiful model. What does it mean for Abraham to come to Canaan, not with the consciousness that this is my land and I'm going to take it from everyone, but with the consciousness I am a stranger and therefore I have to defer to everyone? So, I don't have the It's Time up here. If someone wants to call out the page, that's useful.
Why don't you tell us the chapter?
I'm going to, yes, chapter 23 in Genesis. Right at the beginning.
Page 127.
Thank you.
127. Chapter 23.
So let's have someone read the first 6 verses. This is the prelude, or preface. Yeah, go ahead.
Sarah's lifetime, the span of Sarah's life, came to 127 years. Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, now Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham proceeded to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead and spoke to the Hittites, saying, I am a resident alien among you. Sell me a burial site among you, that I may remove my dead for burial. And the Hittites replied to Abraham, saying to him, Hear us, my lord, you are the elect of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold his burial place from you for burying your dead.
Great, thanks. So there's a little translation glitch in that, which misses some of the texture. What does Abraham call himself when he first opens his mouth to speak? Yes, and what's the Hebrew for that? That's verse 4.
Ger v'toshav.
Ger v'toshav.
It's an and.
Yeah, there's an and. So it's ger v'toshav. Ger means what we usually translate as stranger. It means someone that's not a member of the people that you're part of. Ger. And toshav means a temporary dweller. It's often can be translated as settler, but settler has unfortunate other implications now that get confusing. It means someone who's come to settle temporarily. Sojourner is sometimes how it's translated. So a stranger and sojourner. With you. Does it say with you in the Hebrew that you just read? Among you. I want you to pay attention to that locution because it's going to come up in an important way in a few moments. And,
It does.
what's that?
You asked the question, it does. It says, Anochi imachem.
Mm-hmm.
I am with you.
Yeah. I was wondering if the translation says with you.
Oh, among you.
It says among you. So, with you is more accurate. Among you, with you implies I'm part of you, but I have a vulnerable position among you. Yeah. Anochi imachem. So then Abraham gets up and bows down to the community and says, please let me buy it. I don't want you to give me a place in your burial place to bury Sarah. I want my own burial place that is mine only. Right? So he's essentially asking for a certain kind of right that only a resident might normally have. But he asks it with complete deference. This is in your hands. You don't have to do this, but would you please do this for me? Now, how many times has Avram been promised all this land already by God? 4 times. He already knows that this is supposed to be his. And not only that, he's not just a kind of single person negotiating without power. Remember, before this, there's the war of the 4 kings against the 5 kings. And he goes out and he smashes the kings that took Sodom and kidnapped Lot. He smashes them, he destroys their power, and this is him and just the people that are part of his household. So militarily, he's already been shown to be mighty. I'm not talking in terms of history, but in terms of story. The story has already told us Abraham doesn't have to defer. If he wants militarily to accomplish something, he can. But this is the Abraham who we have here, who is completely deferential. And then we have this very interesting negotiation. Abraham buys it from Ephron, and that's the end of that story. It's a beautiful story in many ways, and it's also a subtle story, the way they negotiate. You should just take it from me. It's only worth 200. Okay, that's the price, right? But Ger v'toshav is how Avram sees himself in relation to everyone else, a stranger and a sojourner. Is this something that's just temporary until his descendants come and conquer the rest of the land? Well, look at Leviticus 25:23. So this is the description of the Shemitah year. And remember, the first description of the Shemitah year is what we had in this week's Parsha.
Somebody has page 741.
741, got it? Maybe I should have the Eis Chaim up here instead of using this one. It's okay, I think it's probably okay. So in the description, the big description, this is the bigger, fuller description of what Shemitah is about. In Exodus, we just get a very small number of verses. Here we get a full chapter, and then a full chapter of what happens if you don't observe it. Yeah. God says, you can never sell the land because you never really own it. So you are essentially a leasee on God's land. And this is very aligned with some other kinds of indigenous wisdom against the idea of property as being true ownership, right? So we have God saying, verse 23, Ha'aretz lo timacher litzmitut, the land you may not sell. This is usually translated as permanently Litzmitud is an unusual word, so what it precisely means is not known. Ki li haaretz, for the land is mine. Ki gerim v'toshavim atem imadi. For you are, what? Ger v'toshav. In other words, even when you're fully in the land, even when you fully possess the land, even when you've been farming the land for generations, you're still only ger v'toshav. So Avram is not describing his temporary state, but he's describing the ideal permanent state of what the Jewish people are supposed to be, or really the Israelite people are supposed to be, in this land, even when they come to take it over, conquer it, whatever we want to call that. So the idea of being strangers is foundational. We already know it's foundational to ethics between human beings. That's what it means to have one in Leviticus 19, one commandment that says, love your neighbor like yourself, ahaftarecha kamocha. And the other one says, love the ger, the stranger, like yourself, for you were strangers in Egypt. Or the other verse which says, for you know the soul of the stranger. You know what it means. We are trying to create a culture, our ancestors were trying to create a culture where the consciousness of being strangers would never abate and would never leave them. That was the foundation for all Torah ethics. And it operates in two realms. One is how you treat other human beings, and the other is how you treat the land. And these are the only important things to the Torah, actually. How you treat the land is equally important to how you treat human beings. But in both cases, the way to get to the right, proper treatment of other people and the land is to think of yourself as a stranger. Okay, this all makes sense? Any questions? Okay. Now, I usually spend a full 2 hours on this one point. So we kind of sped through that a little bit. There's a whole other, yes, Penina.
So the interesting tension is that you treat the stranger as yourself. That's when you have others treat you. But you also have a notion of boundaries. You are of the Israelite people. It's not an assimilationist ethic. Right. So the question is how you keep boundaries and still keep that notion of total respect and exchange.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And they are in tension with one another and stuff.
Yeah, the tension between having the integrity as a people, understanding who you are and having and maintaining your identity, and embracing the stranger who's not sharing your identity.
I think it's interesting in this verse in Leviticus, it's God saying, okay, the land is mine. You are but strangers resident with me. That's ger v'toshav vis-a-vis God.
God, yes.
Which to me is a different notion than in the verses about Abraham. You know, there he is, he's talking to this other leader, right? And he's talking about his relationship either to the other people or to the land. So this seems to me a different dimension.
Oh, it is. It's a whole, we've gone from a negotiation between people to our relationship with God. So it's completely different. But as we say, siman, Maaseh avot siman labanim is a common phrase in Talmudic and Aggadic, Midrashic thought. The acts of the ancestors are a sign for what will be true for the descendants. And it's in that vein that it kind of one goes straight, flows into the other. Yeah?
I just want to say, I think it's, where my mind is going is obviously we are strangers with regard to God. If God, I mean, not everybody has this vision. I'm speaking from a certain notion. You know, I think we're totally unlike God. So yeah, we're strangers, always.
True.
But that may not be the point here, but the language is striking to me.
Yeah, I hear you. It still remains more striking that if we are an indigenous people, we're an indigenous people that keep saying that we're not indigenous. And this is one more way in which we're saying we're not indigenous. Many indigenous cultures have stories about the people being born from the land that they're on. And that says a very different thing than our culture. So our culture doesn't fit the typical indigenous culture. It's a different kind of culture. So it's similar in that it doesn't accept the idea of permanent property ownership, but it's also different because it doesn't posit that we have this permanent, inviolable connection to the land. In fact, it's violable, right? What are the promises about the land? There's 3 promises. One is you will get to inherit this land. The promise is made to Abraham. The second one is if you mistreat the stranger or the land, then you don't get to be in this land and you get put into exile. So it's not an inviolable connection. The third promise is after enough time has passed and if you got your head on straight finally, then you can come back and try again. So the inviolability is not the relationship always continuing, but always the opportunity to try again and get it right at the next time. Which is different than saying we have an inviolable connection to that land. Yeah.
Yeah, couple things. One is that I'm struck by the parallels in this narrative with the indigenous traditions right here on Turtle Island and also within the modern environmental movement. If I came across that passage in random, no context, I would think this might have been Iroquois. This might have been Navajo. So I find that really interesting. But also, you found one of a number of passages in which Abraham is negotiating with his neighbors. There's another one that I actually use in one of my talks about water rights, where who's drilling a well and who gets to use that well, and well, I'm going to let you have this one, I'll take this other one. No, actually, we want that one too. I don't have the citation, but you probably have come across
I'll give it to you. So that's Isaac. It says Isaac redug the wells of his father, and then in Isaac it goes to the 3rd or 4th power because it says he digs the wells that the Philistines had stopped up because they stopped up the wells that belonged to Abraham. So he redigs them, and then the Gerari shepherds, who are part of that group, fight over them. And Isaac's immediate response is to leave. If you want to fight over it, it's your well. So he does that twice. And then the 3rd time he redigs a well, nobody fights over it. So then he gives it the name Rehovot, wide spaces. Because, he says, God has made enough room for us to thrive in the land. Which is also, even the one who stayed in the land the whole time, the one who was sort of the anchor for being in the land, Isaac, his approach to the other people in the land is, if you're fighting me, it means I'm too much in your domain and I'm going to retreat. I'm going to make more space for you. And that's stunning in a way. You know, he's very clear about what the principle is in terms of how he needs to behave in relation to the people of that land. I was going to look up the exact. Well, I'm not sure if it matters that much since I already told you. I think it's in Parshat Toldot. So I'm not going to look it up right now.
I have a citation at home.
Yeah, well, it's easy to find. There's 2 more pieces of information I want to put in here that have to do with the ecology of the land and what that has to say about all these questions. So if you remember, in the 2nd paragraph of the Shema, it says how if you follow the laws, you'll get the rain in its time, everything will be fine, you'll get grass in the field for your cattle, and if not, the heavens will be shut up and the earth will not give her produce. So there's a paragraph before that gives us more information about what that means that's rather important for understanding the ecology of the land and what it means to be in Canaan. So if you turn to chapter 11 in Deuteronomy, and we're looking at verse 10. Verse 10. So what leads up into that is, I'm just going to read the verses right before that.
1051.
1051. Watch over all the commandment which I'm commanding you today for the sake of your being strengthened, and you will come into inherit, and you will inherit the land. which you are passing over there to inherit her. And do it for the sake of lengthening days on, it says days, not your days. Do it for the sake of you lengthening days on the ground, which Adonai swore to your ancestors to give to them and to their seed, the land flowing with milk and honey. Now we get to verse 10. And would someone read verse 10 through 12?
For the land that you are about to enter and possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come. There the rain you sowed had to be watered by your own labors like a vegetable garden. But the land you are about to cross into and possess, a land of hills and valleys, soaks up its water from the rains of heaven. It is a land which the Lord your God looks after, on which the Lord your God always keeps the Lord's eye for the years beginning to years end.
Mm-hmm. So, this is somehow some kind of description of praise of the land, but it's not clear what's being praised. So first of all, what does it mean to water with your foot like a garden? Does anyone know? Louder?
You have to haul water from somewhere.
So that would be the model that it makes it harder work to be in Egypt than it is. So that's one interpretation. It's harder work in Egypt than in the Canaan, because in Canaan it comes straight from the heavens, it's given to you, you don't have to haul it anywhere. Whereas in Egypt you have to put it in a bucket, carry it out to your field from the river. That's one meaning, and that is a possible interpretation that many people agree with, but it's not correct archaeologically, like in terms of actual history. So the other interpretation is that it's super easy to water your garden. And how do you do it with your foot is that there's a very simple foot pedal apparatus that lifts the water up and then enables it to flow out into the field, because the Nile, the plain in which the Nile sits is all a floodplain, and it's exceedingly flat. So you don't have to do much at all. First of all, the river by itself will water 3 times a year, I was told actually, will water the fields anyway. But then also, because it makes it so flat, you just have to lift the water a tiny amount and it will go through whatever channel you put all the way out into your fields at quite a distance. So it's actually super easy, barely an inconvenience, to send that water out. Yeah? So that's probably what this means. And in Canaan, what does it mean to say that the eyes of God are on it from the beginning of the year to the end of the year? God is always doing what? Watching for what?
How you're behaving?
Yeah, how you're behaving, how you're treating the land. And what happens if you're not behaving right and you're not treating the land right? Drought. That's the next paragraph of the Shema, right? If you don't do it, drought. Pretty much instantaneous. Is there such thing as drought in Egypt? Not in the mythical Egypt that we have in our stories. Generally speaking, the Nile is reliable. And it was only there's 2 instances, right? One is they have the 7 years of famine that happened under Joseph. And then the other is that you have the 10 plagues when they're coming out of Egypt. So most of the time, Egypt is completely fertile. That's why it was the breadbasket that everyone came to when there was famine in Canaan, and actually throughout that region of the world. Everyone went down to Egypt to get provisions. That's the whole story of Joseph. Everyone coming to him. And they had enough fertility that they could store up 7 years of grain and feed themselves for 7 years, both at the same time. So that for 7 more years, they could not only just continue to feed themselves, but to feed the entire region. Right? So that's a very high fertility. And the problem is this: if you are in Egypt, where you can get away with bad behavior, say enslaving a people for several hundred years, as an example of bad behavior, then when the shit hits the fan, it's going to be really bad. Because you've deferred the moral consequences of your actions for generations and perhaps centuries. Whereas in Canaan, the consequences of your actions will happen within a matter of months. So what they're saying is, Canaan is such a great place because you will get judged by God really quickly. Which sounds counterintuitive to us. In fact, our whole civilization is based on the principle that we can defer the consequences of our actions. That's one of the main functions of technology, is to defer those consequences. And when the shit hits the fan, aka climate change, it will be global and it will be, it's already happened, of course, but it will be catastrophic across the world, right? But if you get that feedback every few months, then you're never going to get into that place where you owe so much because the sins are so great that you're going to get wiped out.
Has that been understood, that interpretation been understood for, through all the commentary on up to now?
Some commentaries, yeah. Is that the way it's understood in all the commentaries? And the answer is some of the commentaries. Just like some of the commentaries think Egypt's the easy place and Canaan's the hard place. And some commentaries read it the opposite way. So archaeologically, there's a reason to know which one is more correct for its original context. But multiple interpretations, of course, are the norm for us, right? Which is great. Anyway, but that's the peshat of the text. That's like the simple meaning of the text, and that's proven by the next paragraph of the Shema, that that's what we're talking about. The thing that is interesting is that our ancestors wanted that. That was like their ideal. I want to be in a relationship with God where if I do wrong, I will get immediate consequences. That's how they, or the people who passed us this text, understood what was happening and what they thought was ideal. Now I wanted to take a step back from all this. One of the things that is clear about these texts is that the consequence of not behaving is that you don't get to live in the land. You get exiled from the land. Okay, and that happens in multiple places in Deuteronomy. It happens it's discussed throughout the Torah. If you think about the first story of the human beings, that is the second story of Genesis, actually, not the first story. In chapter 2, rather. 3 times it says the purpose of the human is to serve the land. 3 times. And you'll see it's mistranslated consistently. Let's see if what you have in Eitz Chaim. But this one has chapter 2, verse 5. Chapter 2, verse 5, page 13. Now all the trees of the field were not yet on the earth, and all the herb of the field had not yet sprouted. For Hashem God had not sent rain upon the earth, and there was no man to work the soil. To work the soil. What do you have in Eitz Chaim? Till the soil. So, la'avod et ha'adamah. That means to serve. It can even mean to worship. I'm not saying that's what it means here, because worship is already a much later concept. To separate worship from service is already many centuries in the future. There's not a distinction between service and worship. But here we have the purpose of the human is to serve the ground. And it doesn't mean to work the ground. Work the ground means you make the ground serve you. That's what that means. And this is the opposite. So if you look again a little bit further down, verse 8. Adonai Elohim planted a garden in Eden to the east and placed there the Adam whom God had formed. And then it says, where do we get to? Verse 15 repeats the same idea. And Adonai Elohim took the human and placed him, or them, in Gan Eden, la'ovdah l'shamra. La'ovdah l'shamra. So that's the end of verse 15, the end of verse 15. So there's 2 things to note here. First of all, the human is formed and created in a different place than the Garden of Eden, and then put into the Garden of Eden. This is a detail that's not usually noticed. And then secondly, we have now twice it's said that the purpose of the human is to avod, la'avod, to serve the ground. And we have here the locution la'avda. La'avda. That's the same exact grammatical form as when we say to serve God in the second paragraph of Shema. La'avdo b'chol levavchem u'b'chol nafshechem. There's no distinction grammatically between the two terms. To serve him or to serve her. Same thing. So the big picture is that our ancestors understood agriculture as an act of service to the ground. That somehow the ground was, the purpose of agriculture is to benefit the ground first, and the secondary effect is that we get to eat. But the first purpose is to serve. And that's a different understanding of agriculture than happened in other places. Where was agriculture, the plow and all these kinds of things invented? Do people know? Sumer, a few thousand years before all this stuff. Here's what you need to know about Sumer. They didn't know any limitations. They thought that the ground was serving them. And they have a whole story about, in the Gilgamesh epic, about how Gilgamesh got together with Enkidu, the forest man, and tamed the forest man, and then he and the forest man, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, go to slay the god of the forests, Humbaba. And then after that, they can strip the cedars and then build in Sumer their palaces out of wood. Now, there's no wood growing in Sumer, right? So this was a mark of extraordinary wealth that they were talking about. But all the time, what they invented was the plow and the wheel and writing, and it's not bad, huh? They did pretty good. But they didn't know ecology. You can't really blame them. But the Tigris and the Euphrates, the banks of the rivers are higher than the land around it. So like Egypt, it's very easy to water your land. You just make a little channel in the bank, and you can water whatever you want. But the result of that is that it raises the water tables, and the water that's deep underground is salt water, not fresh water. So once the water table reaches the level of the ground, that's the end of agriculture. Right? So this happened several times going up the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates, where civilization started and then wiped themselves out because they did agriculture in this wrong way. Now, one thing that's true about a rain-fed agriculture like Canaan is that you cannot have the ground become salty, because the rain is always washing the salt out. It's the opposite of Sumerian agriculture and the opposite of Egyptian agriculture, both. Abraham comes from that land, Mesopotamia. Sumer is part of Mesopotamia. It is possible, but this is truly conjecture, it is possible that what it means to say that Abraham comes from Mesopotamia is to say that there's some kind of mythical memory of ecocide in the place that Abraham came from. Because Canaan is the opposite of Mesopotamia, and it's the opposite of Egypt in the way it functions ecologically. The third time that it says that the human is to serve the ground comes, let's see, I'm going to find it. Verse 23 in chapter 3. Verse 23 in chapter 3. So this is after they eaten from the tree of knowledge, the tree of knowing good and bad. And God sends them out of the garden. But God doesn't cast them out of the garden to wander blindly and aimlessly. We have a very specific line here. Adonai Elohim exiled the human from the Garden of Eden to serve the soil that they were taken from. So they're not going out into the wilderness, they're actually going home. When they're exiled from the garden, they're sent home. The way I understand this is that the scripture is saying the humans didn't get the right relationship with the land in the Garden of Eden, but maybe they'll be able to do tshuva by being in the land that they're born out of. They'll have the kind of identification with the land that will enable them to do it right. So it's an act of compassion that God is sending them out of the garden and putting them in a place that they have the stronger connection to. No, that doesn't work either. Cain kills Abel. The rest of human tragedy happens, otherwise known as human history. However, there's a paradigm set up here, which is that when the human is in the Garden of Eden, the human is in exile from the place they're born out of, the soil they're born from. And when they're in the place that they're born from, they're in exile from the Garden of Eden. So that no matter where they are, they're in exile from someplace else. And this theme becomes it's a mythological motif that explains the condition of the Israelite people and then the Jewish people, which is that exile is the natural state of being in some way or another. So that means when you're in the land where you belong, that God supposedly gave you, you're in exile because you're still strangers in relation to the land and in relation to God. You don't own it. And then when you're in exile from that land, of course you are in exile. And that paradigm is again reinforcing this idea that humans do not own the planet. And can never. Now that's obviously putting it in modernist sounding terms. But that's fundamentally what's going on here. Somebody didn't like the idea that we should always be in exile. Somebody didn't like the idea that we can never own the soil. I mean, that's what the Joshua stories are doing. They're counteracting that idea. There's one story in Genesis which tells an seemingly opposite consequence. A story where there is conquest of the land. What's the story of conquest that happens in Genesis? Anyone can think of it? Shechem. Right, so it says Jacob came to Shechem, Shalem, whole, and he bought a campsite from Hamor, father of Shechem, for 200 kesitas. And then Dinah goes out to see the daughters of the land, and then she gets either raped or secluded. It's unclear for sure. There's debate about whether this is rape or seduction by Shechem. And then Shechem and his father Hamor come and say, can we please make this a marriage, make this official, and we'll marry your children will marry ours, and it'll all be great. We can all join together, it'll be great. And the brothers say, sure, you just all have to get circumcised. And so they convince everyone to get circumcised, and then when they're in pain, as it says, on the third day, they go in, and the Shimon and Levi kill every male. And they take captive every female and every child, and all the cattle and animals, and they take the city. It now becomes an Israelite place. And that story seems to valorize, if you just read the story itself, the idea of conquest. But in fact, it's an anti-conquest story. Because, and this is well known, when Jacob initially encounters Shimon and Levi after they kill everyone, he doesn't rebuke them morally. He says, you've made me stink in the nostrils of the people of the land, and now anyone who wants will come and kill me. So he doesn't give it any moral reasoning at all. But then when he's dying, I mean, why doesn't he? My theory is he's scared to death of them. They're so violent. Because then at the end of his life, when he doesn't have to be scared of them anymore, what does he tell them? He says, Shimon and Levi are weapons of violence. Let my counsel not come among them. I will scatter them in Jacob and divide them in Israel. Which is interpreted to mean that they get no inheritance of the land. So of all the tribes, 2 of them are not going to inherit any land in Canaan, Shimon and Levi. And in fact, what this is saying is if you get the land by conquest, you don't get any land at all. It's a very straight moral. It's complicated because the end of the story is separated by a bunch of chapters from the beginning of the story. But if you read the whole book, it's not even slightly ambiguous. Genesis is anti-conquest. In Joshua, a bunch of things happen at Shechem, and it mentions in Joshua the campsite that Jacob bought for 100 kesitas. But what doesn't it mention? It doesn't mention the genocide. It didn't happen. Nothing to see here, folks. Credits will do fine. You know the reference? No? Star Wars reference, sorry. It erases the story of the genocide in Shechem. It tells several stories of genocide by Joshua, but it erases the story of genocide in Shechem. It doesn't want that story anymore to be part of our canon, to be part of our stories. Not only that, but in Joshua, unlike the other places in the Torah, Shimon inherits land. Again, contradicting the point of Genesis, which is that if you do it by conquest, you don't get land. You had a hand up.
I hate to interrupt you, but I'm mindful of the time, and we don't have the text of Joshua in front of us, I don't think. So my question is any harsh warfare, is any warfare of conquest necessarily genocide?
No, Joshua specifically is the idea that you have to kill everyone once you conquer it. That's genocide. No, just conquest is not inherently, yeah. In fact, we know from King David's court that, David conquered Jerusalem in some fashion, but his court is full of people who are the Canaanite tribes. There's no hint that there's genocide. The only hint is that they took over Jerusalem, and everyone who lived there they were part of the court itself. They weren't like slaves, they weren't servants, they were dignitaries in his court, right? So that's really clear that that's not the story that was actually happening. I mean, those stories, of course, are also retellings generations after it happened, but there's reason to believe that that's a historical truth. And there's reason to believe that the Joshua genocide stories are historical fiction. Yeah.
So as we're coming into Purim, as you mentioned, how does the Purim narrative that starts with an attempted genocide against the Jews and ends with a massive genocide by the Jews against their oppressors, how does that fit in?
That's a great question. So first of all, it's not genocide what the Jews do back because they do it to all kinds of people who are after them. It's not trying to wipe out a particular people, but all the people that were going to wipe them out. So that's not genocide. It's pretty bad. It's 75,000 people killed. The end of Purim's story. Yeah, so all the people that were planning to attack the Jews got killed by the Jews. But the one thing that's interesting that might be worth reflecting on is Haman is a descendant of the people that the Israelites supposedly genocided earlier. Shmuel did, specifically. He killed everyone but Agag, and then Agag had children in the few moments before he was then killed by Shaul. Shaul conquered Amalek. And then Shmuel comes after and says, "Why didn't you kill the king?" And then he kills the king. So in the space of time between when Shaul conquers Amalek and Shmuel kills Agag, supposedly he managed to find somebody to have sex with so that he could have children. And then, not so he could. He did have children, therefore, and one of his descendants is Haman. So Haman has good reason to hate the Israelites, and why doesn't Mordecai bow down to Amalek? Well, I mean, people bow down to kings all the time. Okay, so he's not the king. You're allowed to bow down to a king. I mean, it's not assumed to be idolatry. He doesn't bow down to him because he's an Amalekite. He's among the people that were supposed to have been genocided. So there's this enmity that is inherent between Haman and Mordecai. The interesting question is, why does it play out on the world stage of this sort of tragic comedy? It depends on how you look at it, but it's more of a comedy than a tragedy in a way. Why is that playing out in this play in this way, which leads to even more murder, even more killing? And what's the message we're supposed to learn from that? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think what I'm sure about is that the rabbis neutralized by that message by saying the purpose of Purim is to get to a state where you can't tell the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordecai, where you understand that the mitzvah is to transcend the enmity. So I don't know what the people who wrote Esther meant for us to learn from it, but I know a lot about what the rabbis meant for us to learn from it. And that's a pretty good lesson. The rabbis also taught us that the people that count as Canaanites don't exist anymore. And therefore, all the commandments about genocide have zero function in the world. But the problem is, you can say they have no function halakhically, because they don't. They're completely irrelevant halakhically in Jewish law. They've already were neutralized for, 1,500 years at least. But people still get inspired, people of that ilk, get inspired by those stories to do violence now. And the violence in the West Bank against Palestinian farmers is tremendous and terrible, and only increased during the Gaza war. None of that excuses the so-called resistance, which is so violent, that Hamas did to us. Nothing excuses that. But it's also true that we have our own demons, that we need to somehow, I don't know what we're supposed to do with our demons. I mean, I know what I would do if I were the government of Israel. If anyone committed any act of racism, even so much as incitement, I was painting a slogan, they would be banished from the West Bank and wouldn't be allowed to return. That would be very simple and clear. But that's not the government that we have in Israel. So that's not going to happen. And people know that probably that one of the reasons why the IDF was so slow to respond to the Hamas attack is because so many soldiers were there protecting settlers in the West Bank. So these are tragic decisions with tragic consequences. None of the things I've taught today are solutions, except they help us think better about maybe what the problem is. Yes?
That nobody owns the land, that you are there to serve the land. What is rabbinic Judaism?
Well, most of that comes out in the laws about Shemitah, actually, the sabbatical year. So, for example, in the sabbatical year, because it says that the wild animals have to be able to eat from what grows in the field, you're supposed to take down your fences. And anyone can go into anyone's field and take whatever they need, as long as they're taking it for what they need. You can't hoard it to sell. Shemitah produce is not allowed to be sold, right? But you can take what you need. There's a certain amount, like for 3 days, you can take 3 days supply at a time. Because it has to be accessible to anyone, if a crop stops growing in the fields so that the wild animals can't get it anymore, then you're not allowed to eat it in your house either. So basically, they took Shemitah and turned it into what is already suggested in the Torah, a reversion to a kind of hunter-gatherer society for a year, in which there's literally no distinction between the ger and the ezrach, because land ownership in that year means nothing. And so the fact that you are a ger and don't own land doesn't disadvantage you in any way. So that's what they did with it. They took the Shemitah, made it much bigger in terms of what its spiritual impact could be. But I think directly in line with what the Torah is already saying. In general, there's a lot of property law that's part of Judaism, and it's very intricate. And it's just as intricate as any property law in any society where you can officially own the land. So we didn't escape that. The rabbis still deal with normal society when it's normal, but they make sure that there's 1 year out of 7 where it's not normal anymore. And you don't forget that. And we have, this is part of the whole tradition, not specifically rabbinic, we have the Shabbat, which is the mini Shemitah. The Shemitah is a Shabbaton for a whole year. We practice to get ready for Shemitah every single week, 1 day a week. It's a very extraordinary spiritual practice. Every week we practice for being ready to be able to ultimately do Shemitah, where people live in radical equality.
You were going to go toward a little bit of explaining that the things we read in Joshua were some kind of response of like a later, like the Deuteronomist or somebody to...
Those are the questions I have without having the answers, which I think I said at the time also. But it seems to me that the idea that somehow we're always in exile no matter where we were, and that conquest is bad, that doesn't appeal to a certain kind of I don't know, macho idea of what it means to be a people. You know? So maybe, what was the reaction? Were the monarchies already conquering land and then they needed to come up with a justification for it? A theological justification for it, or a theological model to explain how it fits in? Or was it a party that wanted there to be conquering to happen? And that wasn't happening and they wanted to push it so that it did happen?
The story of modern Judaism, that all around people are owning their land and have a national identity associated with land, and there you are.
Right, if you're subject to empires on the left side and the right side of your territory, which they were, does that motivate you to try to become like them a little bit in order to take back some of your power? And I think that makes sense. That definitely makes sense. So what's the precise, we would have to know precisely when these stories came into the Jewish canon, or started being told even before there was a canon, that is, and what was going on. And it's possible that the answer is out there, and I just have to learn it. Because this is like a part of the question where I'm actively researching and don't have the answer yet. Yeah. Anything else?
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. There's a lot to say, as you can tell. If you want to go read through Joshua with me sometime, happy to do it, Lois.
Oh, no, I was just standing up.
If you want to like have a little group where we read through Joshua together, that might be a worthwhile thing to do.
We'll see.
But you can make a list of all the conquests that were genocidal, the ones that weren't in Joshua, the ones that were. The Joshua also talks about how this tribe conquered this land, but they didn't conquer that one tribe, that one Canaanite tribe, and they're still there today. So even Joshua admits that's not the reality, historical reality, even if it keeps telling these stories. Yes?
I have so many questions, but one thing, I thought you made a move a little bit when you were talking about the Genesis stories between, this is a story to tell the Jews that they're not attached to the land, and it's a universalist story. And I want to read it as universalist because that makes me feel better. Is that okay? If I can take these lessons as universal lessons, the non-attachment?
But the universal lesson is the indigenous people says the right way to be indigenous is to say you're not indigenous. That's the universal lesson. How does this affect how we deal with politics today? Well, you can see there's a lot of threads that go out into what's going on now that might inform how we act and how we talk. So this Thursday, Roots Judor, which is an organization of settlers, Israeli Jewish settlers from the West Bank and Palestinians from the West Bank that work closely together, that imagine coexisting, where the settlers want there to be a Palestinian state and they're okay with living in it. Because what they care about is the land, not the state. They're speaking at 7:30. It's Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger and Khalid Abu Awad at Bombix Beit Ahava. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.